when Margaret moved into her suburban neighborhood. She envisioned a quiet, peaceful life filled with the simple joys of homeownership. Her modest house came with a neat front yard, a small porch, and just enough space to plant the garden she had always dreamed of. She wasn't a woman who demanded much. She simply wanted a home that reflected her love for nature. After years of apartment living, the chance to put her hands in the soil and grow something vibrant was more than exciting. It was healing. One spring, Margaret decided to transform her dull, patchy lawn into a small oasis of color. She carefully selected flowers that reminded her of her childhood: bright tulips, cheerful marigolds, and radiant geraniums. She even added lavender near the porch, knowing its soft fragrance would greet her every morning. Every plant was chosen with care, planted with patience, and nurtured with love. By the time summer rolled around, her yard looked like something out of a postcard. Neighbors stopped to compliment her on the beautiful display. Children walking home from school slowed down just to admire the bright hues. Even passers-by who didn't live in the neighborhood smiled when they saw the little burst of life in Margaret's yard. It was harmless, cheerful, and entirely hers. Or so she thought, because in this neighborhood, beauty was only tolerated if the Homeowners Association approved it, and the HOA was known for being strict, sometimes unreasonably so. They had rules about the color of mailboxes, the length of grass, even the type of blinds residents could hang in their windows. Margaret had heard the warnings before she moved in, but she had assumed that as long as she kept her property neat and respectable, she wouldn't have any problems. That illusion shattered one morning when she opened her mailbox to find a stark white envelope with the HOA's logo stamped on the front. Inside was a letter that immediately soured her mood. The letter claimed her flowers were unapproved colors that disrupted the visual uniformity of the neighborhood. The board demanded she remove them within 10 days or face daily fines until the violation was corrected. Margaret stared at the words in disbelief. These were flowers. Beautiful, harmless flowers that hurt no one. How could they possibly be a violation? At first, she thought it must be a mistake. Surely, no one would take issue with something so minor. But as the days passed, the HOA's position became clearer. Another notice arrived, this one colder in tone. And then, a neighbor whispered to her that one of the board members, a woman known for her sour expression and love of control, had personally complained about Margaret's garden. That neighbor used a word everyone in the community knew, but never said too loudly: Karen. Margaret felt a mix of anger and disbelief. She had spent weeks planting those flowers, pouring her time and energy into them. To have them dismissed as unapproved felt not only unfair but deeply personal. She considered writing a polite letter back, explaining her intentions, but something inside her shifted. Why should she have to justify planting flowers in her own yard? Instead, she began to research. She pulled out the HOA handbook given to her when she moved in, a thick packet of bylaws and rules that most people never bothered to read. She highlighted, scribbled notes in the margins, and spent late nights flipping through page after page. The more she read, the more something curious stood out to her. Nowhere did the bylaws specifically mention flower colors. There were vague guidelines about maintaining uniformity and preserving community standards, but nothing concrete that prohibited planting tulips, marigolds, or geraniums. Margaret realized something important. The HOA board wasn't enforcing a rule. They were enforcing their preferences. And preferences were not the same as bylaws. The injustice lit a fire inside her. She had never been the type to seek out conflict, but she also wasn't someone who backed down when pushed unfairly. If the HOA thought they could bully her into submission, they were mistaken. What they didn't realize was that Margaret was stubborn, resourceful, and, thanks to her career in accounting, very good at reading fine print. She decided she wouldn't remove the flowers. She wouldn't pay the fines. Instead, she would prepare. Every note she received from the HOA, she carefully filed away. Every interaction with a board member, she documented. And every time she walked past her blooming garden, she felt her determination strengthen. The HOA had just started a fight over flowers. What they didn't realize was that those flowers were about to become the very weapon that exposed them. Margaret wasn't just planting a garden anymore. She was planting the seeds of revenge. And as summer turned to fall, the conflict between a woman and her HOA was only just beginning. Margaret's defiance didn't go unnoticed. At first, it was subtle. She would see the HOA president, Karen, drive by her house more often than usual. Her eyes narrow behind oversized sunglasses, her lips pursed in disapproval. Other board members followed suit, slowing their cars as they're conducting inspections. Margaret could feel their scrutiny every time she stepped outside to water her flowers. What had once been her peaceful routine now felt like a silent battleground. Within weeks, the HOA escalated their attack. A certified letter arrived, stamped with official legal language. The letter informed Margaret that daily fines of $50 were being applied to her account until she complied with a demand to remove the flowers. Margaret didn't even flinch when she read it. She had already prepared for this. She created a binder where she logged each letter, attached copies, and even printed emails exchanged to the board. She wasn't going to fight with emotion. She was going to fight with evidence. But the HOA wasn't content with just letters and fines. They started spreading whispers around the neighborhood. A neighbor casually mentioned that the board had implied Margaret was difficult and non-compliant. Others began keeping their distance, afraid of being associated with her. Margaret noticed how quickly fear spread when the HOA flexed its power. People had seen what happened to those who resisted. Lawn violations, parking fines, mailbox warnings. Anyone who dared to push back usually gave up. The HOA counted on intimidation to win. Yet Margaret remained calm. She kept her flowers watered, trimmed, and vibrant, as if daring the board to come closer. To her, every blooming petal was a statement. I will not be bullied. The board escalated again. At the next community meeting, Karen publicly called out a certain homeowner for willfully disregarding community standards. Though Margaret's name wasn't mentioned, everyone knew who it was. She felt eyes on her as she sat quietly in the back, flipping through her copy of the bylaws. When Karen declared that unapproved floor displays threatened property values, Margaret nearly laughed out loud. But what struck Margaret most that night wasn't the board's arrogance. It was the silence of the homeowners. Nobody spoke up. Nobody asked questions. Nobody challenged Karen. That silence told Margaret everything she needed to know. People weren't supporting the board because they agreed with them. They were silent because they were afraid. That was when Margaret realized her fight wasn't just about flowers anymore. It was about the principle. The HOA was used to uncheck power, and the community had been conditioned to accept it. But Margaret wasn't willing to surrender her independence. So she doubled down. She filed formal requests for documentation, financial reports, meeting minutes, and board decisions. By law, the HOA was required to provide these upon request. At first, they ignored her. Then, reluctantly, they sent heavily redacted documents. But Margaret was patient. She filed again, this time citing the specific bylaw sections that obligated them to comply. Behind the scenes, she began speaking with her neighbors one by one. Quiet conversations at the mailbox. Friendly chats while walking her dog. Slowly, she uncovered a pattern. Margaret wasn't the only one targeted. One family had been fined for having a child's bike visible in their driveway. Another had been threatened for planting a vegetable garden. A retired couple had paid thousands in fines for painting their shutters a slightly darker shade of beige. The more stories she gathered, the clearer it became. The HOA wasn't protecting the neighborhood. They were exploiting it. And Margaret wasn't going to let it continue. Meanwhile, the fines against her piled higher and higher. According to the board's letters, she owed over $2,000 in violations by the end of the second month. Margaret, however, hadn't paid a cent. She smiled every time a new notice arrived, sliding it neatly into her binder, because she knew something the board didn't. Those fines were enforceable unless the HOA followed proper legal procedure. And based on the sloppy way they were handling her case, she doubted they even knew their own bylaws well enough to do it correctly. But the board was growing impatient. When intimidation failed, they prepared for their biggest move yet. Another letter arrived, this one not about flowers, but about foreclosure. According to the HOA, her unpaid fines now justified beginning the process to place a lien on her property. If she didn't comply, they claimed She could lose her home. Margaret sat at her dining table with the letter in her hands, the autumn sun casting shadows across her binder of evidence. For the first time, she allowed herself to feel the weight of what was happening. This wasn't just harassment anymore. This was a direct threat to her home, her stability, her peace. But instead of fear, Margaret felt something sharper, resolve. She had been patient. She had been quiet. She had gathered her evidence, documented every interaction, and studied every line of the bylaws. Now it was time to use it. The HOA thought they could scare her into surrender. What they didn't realize was that in their arrogance, they had given Margaret exactly what she needed, proof of their abuse of power. And with that proof, she was about to turn the tables in a way that would shake the entire board to its core. The fight over flowers was no longer just about color. It was about control. And Margaret was ready to show the HOA what happened when they underestimated the wrong homeowner. Margaret had always considered herself an ordinary woman. She worked quietly, paid her bills on time, and lived without seeking conflict. But the moment the HOA threatened her home, something inside her shifted. What had once been frustration and annoyance transformed into determination. She wasn't just defending her flowers anymore. She was defending her right to live free from intimidation. She opened her binder, now thick with letters, emails, and notes from conversations with neighbors. On the surface, it looked like a collection of petty grievances. But to Margaret, it was the beginning of a case. Each letter carried the HOA's official letterhead. Each fine notice carried a date, a signature, and language that, if read carefully, revealed their carelessness. She noticed contradictions between letters, inconsistencies in fine amounts, and even one notice that referenced a bylaw that didn't exist. The more she read, the clearer it became. The HOA board wasn't just overreaching. They were sloppy, and sloppiness was Margaret's greatest weapon. She began digging deeper. First, she attended another HOA meeting, sitting quietly in the back while Karen and her allies spoke about community harmony and preserving order. Margaret took detailed notes, jotting down every promise and every decision. Then she requested financial records again, this time in writing, sending the letter by certified mail, so they couldn't claim they never received it. 2 weeks later, a thin envelope arrived. It contained partial records, incomplete and riddled with vague expenses. Margaret read them line by line. There were unexplained charges for landscaping that didn't match the work done in the neighborhood. There were reimbursements to board members without receipts. And buried deep in the numbers was something shocking. Tens of thousands of dollars in administrative costs that seemed to vanish into thin air. Margaret felt her pulse quicken. This wasn't just about flowers anymore. The HOA was mismanaging money, possibly even stealing it. But Margaret knew better than to jump to conclusions. She needed evidence, not assumptions. So she started documenting quietly. She took photos of the neighborhood landscaping, showing it hadn't changed in years despite large sums being allocated for upgrades. She discreetly asked neighbors about fee increases, learning that many had noticed their dues rising but hadn't questioned why. At night, Margaret researched HOA laws in her state. She discovered that homeowners had the right to access all financial records, and that the HOA could face penalties if they withheld information. She also learned that board members had a fiduciary duty to act in the best interest of the community. If they were misusing funds, they weren't just being unfair. They were breaking the law. Armed with this knowledge, Margaret crafted her plan. She wasn't going to fight the HOA in the shadows anymore. She was going to expose them publicly. But to do that, she needed to make sure her neighbors understood the truth. So she created copies of the financial documents she had received, highlighting the most suspicious charges. She typed up a simple, clear explanation of what those numbers meant, breaking down the unexplained expenses in plain language. Then one quiet evening, she slipped copies into mailboxes of every homeowner in the neighborhood. By the next morning, the community was buzzing. Neighbors who had once avoided Margaret were now knocking on her door, asking questions. One man admitted he had paid thousands in fines over the years, but never thought to question them. A young couple confessed they were considering moving because of the HOA's harassment. People were angry, angrier than Margaret had expected. The HOA board, however, was livid. Karen called an emergency meeting, accusing Margaret of spreading misinformation and inciting division. But this time, the room wasn't silent. Homeowners spoke up. They demanded answers. They asked about the landscaping costs, the reimbursements, the missing funds. Karen, usually so confident, stammered through excuses. The board tried to deflect, but the damage was done. Margaret sat quietly at the back of the room, watching as the cracks in the board's authority began to spread. For the first time, she felt the balance of power shifting. But she knew the board wouldn't give up easily. They had too much to lose. If financial mismanagement was proven, it could mean the end of their positions and potentially legal consequences. Margaret expected retaliation, and she wasn't wrong. Days later, she received yet another letter from the HOA. This one accused her of defamation and threatened legal action if she continued to distribute information. Margaret smiled as she slid the letter into her binder. Threats didn't scare her anymore, because unlike the HOA, she had nothing to hide. What Karen and the board didn't realize was that Margaret was just getting started. The flowers in her yard had bloomed brighter than ever, defying every warning and fine. And just like those flowers, Margaret's determination had rooted itself deeply. The HOA had declared war. But Margaret wasn't fighting alone anymore. The neighborhood was waking up. The silence that once protected the board had been broken, and voices were rising. Margaret had planted seeds of doubt in the community. Now, those seeds were beginning to grow into something far stronger, a movement. And soon, the HOA would realize that the homeowner they tried to bully had the power to bring their entire empire crumbling down. The HOA board thought they could silence Margaret with threats of lawsuits and fines. But what they didn't understand was that fear had already lost its grip on the neighborhood. The moment homeowners realized they weren't alone, the board's control began to unravel. Margaret had lit a spark, and that spark was spreading fast. Neighbors who once avoided conflict now began sharing their own stories openly. At first, it was whispered conversations on the sidewalks, hushed exchanges at the mailboxes. But soon, frustration boiled over into open defiance. One family refused to pay a fine for leaving their trash can out overnight. Another refused to repaint their shutters the approved shade of beige. The HOA's once ironclad authority was beginning to look brittle. Margaret watched it unfold with quiet satisfaction. She hadn't just defended her flowers. She had given her community permission to stand up, and the more she researched, the more she realized just how deeply the board had abused its power. The financial irregularities weren't isolated. Margaret combed through records line by line, and what she discovered was damning. The board had been collecting special assessments for years, claiming the money was for neighborhood improvements that never materialized. Instead, the funds seemed to vanish into administrative expenses. There were payments to companies with no clear purpose, checks signed by board members to themselves, and entire months where the numbers didn't add up at all. Margaret documented everything meticulously. She created charts, timelines, and comparisons. She wasn't just building a case. She was building a story, one that every homeowner could understand. Then she went a step further. She rented out the community center and announced an unofficial homeowners meeting. The HOA board wasn't happy about it. Karen sent out emails warning residents not to attend, calling it unauthorized and misleading. But when the night of the meeting came, more than half the neighborhood showed up. Margaret stood at the front of the room, her binder and chart spread out on a table. She didn't yell. She didn't dramatize. She simply laid out the facts. Line by line, she showed where money had been collected, where it had supposedly gone, and where the record stopped making sense. Gasps and murmurs filled the room as the truth sank in. The most shocking revelation came when Margaret displayed copies of checks written directly to board members, labeled as reimbursements with no receipts to back them up. One check, Margaret revealed, was written to Karen herself for nearly $5,000. The room erupted. Homeowners who had once paid fines without question were now furious. The board wasn't just overstepping, it was stealing. By the end of the night, the community wasn't just angry, they were united. Neighbors began discussing recall procedures. demanding transparency, and calling for an independent audit of the HOA's finances. For the first time in years, the board's authority wasn't absolute, and at the center of it all was Margaret, the woman they had tried to bully into silence. But with every victory came retaliation. The very next day, Margaret received a letter claiming she had violated noise ordinances by hosting an unauthorized gathering. It came with yet another fine. But this time, Margaret didn't just file it away. She went on the offensive. She contacted a local attorney who specialized in HOA disputes, bringing her binder full of evidence. The attorney was stunned by the level of documentation she had collected. He explained that not only were the fines unenforceable, but the financial misconduct could lead to serious legal consequences for the board members personally. With his guidance, Margaret drafted a cease and desist letter demanding the HOA stop issuing baseless fines against her and threatening legal action if they continued. When the letter was delivered, panic spread through the board. They weren't used to being challenged legally. They weren't used to homeowners who knew their rights. And for Karen, the thought of her personal finances being investigated was a nightmare. But instead of backing down gracefully, the HOA doubled down. They held emergency meetings, passed new rules designed to tighten their grip, and even hired a management company to enforce violations more aggressively. Yet the harder they pushed, the stronger the backlash grew. Because now, Margaret wasn't fighting alone. Her neighbors rallied around her. They refused to pay unjust fines. They demanded transparency at every meeting. And they began organizing a formal recall vote to remove the corrupt board once and for all. The HOA board was cornered. Their authority was crumbling, their finances under scrutiny, and their once silent community now rising against them. Margaret had turned the neighborhood into a force they could no longer control. And as winter approached, the flowers in Margaret's yard still stood tall, their colors bright against the fading grass. They were more than plants now. They were a symbol, a reminder that even the smallest act of defiance could grow into something unstoppable. The HOA had started this fight over flowers, but by trying to crush one homeowner, they had sown the seeds of their own downfall. And Margaret wasn't finished yet. She had exposed their corruption, rallied her neighbors, and shaken their control. But her next move would be the most devastating of all, the one that would ensure the board could never abuse their power again. By the time spring returned, the flowers in Margaret's yard bloomed brighter than ever. They had survived the HOA's wrath, the cold of winter, the endless stream of fines. To the neighbors, those flowers had become more than a garden. They were a banner of resistance. Every time they passed Margaret's house, they saw proof that the board could be challenged and beaten. But Margaret wasn't satisfied with symbolism alone. She had exposed the HOA's shady finances and rallied her neighbors, but the board still clung to power. Karen continued to call emergency meetings, pushing through last-minute rule changes, trying desperately to maintain control. The board still issued fines, even if fewer people were paying them. And Margaret knew that unless something decisive happened, they would find a way to recover. So she prepared her most devastating move. Working with her attorney, Margaret filed a formal complaint with the state regulatory agency that oversaw homeowners associations. She sent copies of the suspicious financial documents, the contradictory fine notices, and even a detailed timeline of the board's harassment. The attorney added legal citations, pointing out every violation of fiduciary duty, every failure of transparency, and every misuse of funds. But Margaret didn't stop there. She also reached out to a local news station known for exposing consumer scams. At first, the producer seemed skeptical, but once Margaret shared her binder, thick with evidence of financial mismanagement, the story became too compelling to ignore. Within a week, a reporter was standing in Margaret's driveway with a cameraman, asking her to explain how her flowers had started a war with the HOA. When the story aired, it spread like wildfire. Footage of Margaret's cheerful, colorful garden contrasted with clips of Karen storming out of meetings and refusing to answer questions. Neighbors went on camera, describing years of harassment and fines. One elderly couple even tearfully revealed how they had drained their savings to pay off fabricated violations. The public reaction was immediate and furious. Viewers flooded the HOA's social media pages with angry comments. Calls poured into the regulatory agency, demanding action. The pressure was too much for the board to ignore. Within weeks, the state launched a formal audit of the HOA's finances. Investigators requested years of bank statements, receipts, and records. Karen and her allies tried to stall, but their stalling only made them look guiltier. And when the first findings were released, the neighborhood was stunned. Tens of thousands of dollars had been misused. Landscaping companies paid for services that were never provided. Checks written directly to board members without documentation. Dues collected for community projects that never existed. It was worse than anyone imagined. The homeowners were furious. They called an emergency meeting, not led by the board this time, but by the residents themselves. One by one, neighbors stood up and demanded change. By the end of the night, they had enough signatures to trigger a recall vote. The recall was brutal. Karen fought tooth and nail, insisting she was a victim of a smear campaign. Her allies tried to sway votes with fear, warning that removing the board would destabilize the neighborhood. But the evidence was undeniable. When the votes were counted, the result was clear. The entire board was removed. Margaret watched as Karen stormed out community center, her face pale with fury, clutching a box of files. For years, she had ruled the neighborhood with intimidation and control. Now, she was nothing more than a disgraced former president, her reputation in shambles. The homeowners wasted no time electing a new board. This time, the members were volunteers who care about the community, not about power. They promised transparency, accountability, and fairness. And the very first action they took was to void every outstanding fine issued under the old regime, including the thousands supposedly owed by Margaret. It was over. The fight that began with a handful of flowers had ended with the complete collapse of a corrupt HOA board. Margaret had not only saved her garden, she had saved her community. But as she stood on her porch, watching her neighbors smile and chat freely for the first time in years, Margaret realized the fight had changed her too. She was no longer just a quiet woman who wanted a peaceful life. She was a homeowner who stood up when no one else would. The one who proved that even the smallest defiance, a patch of colorful flowers, could grow into a revolution. The HOA had underestimated her. They thought she would back down, pay the fines, and fall into line. Instead, she had turned their own rules against them, exposed their corruption, and taken away their power. The crushing blow had been delivered. But for Margaret, the sweetest victory wasn't the downfall of Karen or the board. It was the simple joy of standing in her yard, surrounded by the flowers that started it all, knowing that they would never again be threatened. And yet, even in victory, Margaret knew one more chapter remained. Because while the corrupt board was gone, the scars they left behind lingered. The community needed healing. Trust needed to be rebuilt. And Margaret, though reluctant, realized she now had a role to play in leading that change. The war was over, but the rebuilding was just about to begin. With the corrupt board gone, the neighborhood entered a new chapter. At first, there was an air of celebration. Neighbors who once walked with their heads down now smiled freely. Families who had avoided gatherings because of HOA scrutiny now lingered outside, chatting over fences. Children rode their bikes without fear of fines for leaving toys in the driveway. The invisible weight of constant surveillance had lifted, and people could finally breathe again. But while the community was free of Karen's grip, it wasn't free of the scars she had left behind. Years of mistrust and intimidation had divided people. Some neighbors were reluctant to attend meetings, convinced the new board would turn into the same as the old one. Others were angry, demanding restitution for the thousands they had unfairly paid in fines. And a few, quietly ashamed, admitted they had supported Karen simply out of fear. Margaret saw it all from her front porch, her flowers blooming brighter than ever. For the first time in a long time, she felt peace. But she also understood that real peace required more than the removal of a corrupt board. It required rebuilding trust. Though she had never sought leadership, Margaret found herself at the center of it all. Neighbors looked to her not only as the woman who had taken on the HOA, but as someone who had fought for everyone's freedom. They asked her to join the new board, to help guide the community through its recovery. At first, she hesitated. Margaret had fought for her home, not for power. But then she realized that by stepping forward, she could ensure the same abuses never happen again. Reluctantly, she agreed to serve on one condition, that the new board operate with total transparency. Meetings would be open and recorded. Finances would be posted publicly. Homeowners would be treated as equals, not subjects. To Margaret's relief, the other board members embraced her vision. They weren't in it for control. They were in it for the neighborhood. Slowly, the changes took root. The unnecessary rules were rolled back. Fines became rare, reserved only for true safety issues. Special assessments were explained in clear language, voted on openly and tracked carefully. For the first time in years, the HOA wasn't a weapon of control. It was simply a tool for keeping the community organized. Margaret's garden, once the source of conflict, became a symbol of resilience. The new board even encouraged other homeowners to plant their own displays, celebrating individuality instead of suppressing it. Soon, yards across the neighborhood blossomed with roses, sunflowers, daisies, and tulips. What had once been a uniform, colorless street transformed into a vibrant, welcoming place. As spring gave way to summer, Margaret often walked the neighborhood, admiring the transformation. She saw children playing near flower beds, elderly couples proudly tending their gardens, and neighbors laughing together without fear of fines or judgment. For the first time since she had moved in, the community felt like home. But the sweetest moment came when she saw Karen's house. After the scandal, Karen had quietly sold her property and moved away. Her once perfectly trimmed lawn now belonged to a new family, who wasted no time planting their own colorful garden in the front yard. Margaret smiled as she passed by, knowing that even the most rigid rules couldn't erase the human desire for beauty and freedom. Standing in her own yard, surrounded by her flowers, Margaret reflected on the journey. What had started as a simple act of planting tulips and marigolds had turned into a battle for justice. She had faced threats, intimidation, and even the risk of losing her home. But through patience, determination, and the support of her neighbors, she had not only defended her garden, she had changed the entire neighborhood. The HOA had tried to fine her into submission. Instead, they had planted the seeds of their own downfall. And Margaret, against all odds, had turned those seeds into a garden of freedom. As the sun set over the vibrant street, Margaret knelt in the soil, planting new flowers for the season ahead. She no longer worried about fines, violations, or threats. She planted simply because she loved to. The fight was over. The community was free. And in the heart of it all, Margaret's flowers bloomed brighter than ever, a living reminder that even the smallest acts of defiance could grow into something powerful enough to change everything.